Excremation by Incorrect 3. Our downfall is at our own fault. Our never-ending bloodlust and need for simple resources dragged our species down to the ground, making us turn on each other like savage beasts, which led to the end. I would say this was God's doing, but at this point I don't even believe he exists. Hell, even if he did exist. Is a being willing to create a species so ravenous and murderous even worth our prayers? Furthermore, why would someone who is so all-loving watch as his children suffered and perished? Many have died since it all started, and I deem it very important to write down what has happened, as a guideline as to what not to do if the human race miraculously prevails and makes it through this mess. The first day of our downfall was December 25th, 2020. On such a holy day, nobody would expect something so catastrophic to unfold. Scientists from the US military created a new substance that could be used as a weapon. The substance was officially titled biotoxin chlorine, but it was given the nickname Drop'ems, as the substance would cause those in contact with it to drop to the floor, paralyzed as their skin melted away in mere seconds. The substance was said to be a mix of sulfuric acid, tempered cobra venom, lead, and a few other ingredients that were held confidential to the public. The great thing about Drop'ems was their versatility. They could be compacted into shells as gun ammunition, or packed into bombs as a method of mass destruction. Once scientists created Drop'ems, the beginning of what we like to call the Decade of Dread began. As expected, this was a span of 10 years from 2020 to 2030. Although the US government swore that they would not use Drop'ems unless absolutely needed, reports came in of the US military sneaking the deadly stuff into the battlefield, giving the US a strong advantage. Despite the outcry from the US people, using Drop'ems in wars became common practice. And although the masses hated the stuff, nobody could deny that Drop'ems were incredibly effective at beating rival countries to their knees. By 2023, the countries of China, UK, Japan, and Australia banded together to stop the US's reign of terror. The countries formed a faction called Brap, Biotoxichloroin Removal and Protection, and they had one goal: to stop the United States from being the sole country who had Drop'ems. The problem with Brap is that although their intentions were admirable, they're actually quite flawed. They decided to attempt to fight fire with fire to stop the US from taking over more countries. By mid-2023, the US had already taken control of 17 other countries, all within a span of 2 years, and all because of the deadly Drop'ems. The major territories that were captured and moved into the US were Canada, France, Mexico, and Haiti, and the rest were smaller countries, only taken over for their natural resources. Brap eventually found out the Drop'em recipe with the aid of undercover spies, and began making their own Drop'em ammo, bombs, etc. Hell, they even made a Drop'em sprayer that spewed out the substance in its pure liquid form. Brap was, for lack of a better word, stacked, and when they tried to combat the powerful US, they were oblivious to the fact that they were about to start what was considered to be World War III. On March 1st, 2025, Brap attacked without notice on US soils. The Brap militia attacked San Francisco, and although they were breaking many of the rules of war set in place, they slaughtered thousands. The US Army was sent down to California, and they responded by massacring the Brap militia with a plethora of Drop'em bullets and sprays. It seemed as though Brap was dealt with after the US defended California, but a mere year later, Brap used its first Drop'em bomb on the US. They attacked the city of Boston, and the bomb pulverized the poor city and all of its inhabitants, along with the majority of Massachusetts. The US responded with a much worse course of action. The US dropped a DEB, a Drop'em bomb, in London, England, and sent storms of troops to raid, destroy, and pillage the rest of the UK. The United States degraded to uncivilized tactics used centuries ago, all for the taste of sweet revenge. On May 22nd, 2025, Brap responded in a somehow almost worse manner, proving that they were no better than their adversaries. On May 22nd, they DEB'd 28 states, the most important being New Texas, New York, California, and Illinois. At this point, what was left of civilization in the afflicted states was shambles, and many other states were in complete chaos, leading them to branch off and create a new country called the Alliance of Liberty. Because of the rebelling states, the United States fell into utter chaos, leading more states to rebel and leave the US. Because of this, what was left of the US became a war country, focusing only on making weapons and conquering others. Their first DEB attacks were used against the Alliance of Liberty. Caught off guard, the Alliance was dealt with rather quickly, leading many of the rulers of the states inside the Alliance to come crawling back to the US. The US government responded by enslaving all of the citizens in those states and publicly executing their rulers. Blind with rage and fueled by revenge, on January 4th, 2030, the United States made another destructive war tool, but not one many would suspect. They attempted and succeeded to create a new disease to ravage any countries that stood before them. The disease was called Excre, and was tested on those enslaved by the US. To the delight of the US military, the disease was incredibly deadly, and caused an incredibly slow, painful death, all the while leaving the enemy incapacitated. The disease had different effects on different people, and all were deadly. Some exposed to the disease would drown in their own vomit within minutes, whilst others' blood would boil within their veins, and their organs, for the most part, would melt. The best thing about the disease, however, was that it was easy to spread, as it was found to be airborne. For more study on the diverse effects, the government started taking random slaves or innocent civilians into testing facilities, in which they had cruel experimentations done on them. One such cruel experimentation had the subject pinned down to the table by nails, and then they had their arms ripped off and their bloody stumps injected with Excre. The most sadistic part of all of this, however, is that it was all done without anesthesia or any other medical supplements to reduce pain. There were many more tests conducted, and the United States' unquenchable thirst for blood led to the majority of the US citizens being tested upon and killed, making the US literally a military country and nothing more. Some sadomasochists over in the US military came up with the genius idea of combining drop-ins with Excre to create some sort of biological bomb. The US government was euphoric upon hearing this idea, and decided to see if the two could mix together. At first they were dismayed as the two would not mix. However, with some tinkering by some of the leading scientists in the US, the homegrown disease and drop-ins were able to mix correctly, to the joy of the US. The first test subject for the bioweapon was conducted on the person who submitted the idea in the first place, and the bioweapon worked just as planned, if not better. This combination of destruction became the most catastrophic weapon of mass destruction, and led to what we call the Age of Apocalypse. The US, still enraged by the bombs dropped by Brap in the years prior, launched its first drop-in Excre bombs, deep, in Hong Kong, China, on August 14th, 2031. The bomb obliterated nearly all of China, and for those who survived the explosion were infected by Excre, leading to their demise, or at least what was supposed to happen. After word spread about China's ruined country, the UK sent out investigators in protective armor to search what was left of China. To their shock, the cities and towns were ruined, but strange people with pitch-black skin and large red spots were roaming the demolished city. When provoked, the strange people went AWOL and attacked the investigators and eventually cannibalized them. Only one investigator made it back to tell Scottish officials what had occurred. Soon a fleet of UK soldiers were sent in to combat the strange inhabitants and also search for survivors. After hours of searching, the soldiers found a small group of survivors, all of whom had buried themselves underground during the explosion. Once brought up into the polluted Chinese air, all of them began coughing, and they dropped to the ground. The dim-witted soldiers had forgotten that the air was infected, and led the survivors to their own doom. Once they died of suffocation, the survivors, all in unison, got up, and red boils began to appear on their skin, turned a tarred pitch black. The soldiers fled and ran for their lives, never to return to the forsaken country of China. To get rid of all the infected people, the UK dropped a nuclear bomb on China, but the infected people seemed to bask in the radiation and ran towards the explosion like moths to a flame. The most surprising aspect of this was the fact they all escaped from the deadly explosion unscathed. The soldiers who returned to the UK were fine, or so the doctors thought, and they were allowed into the public after a few weeks of quarantine. Little did they know that even coming into contact with those infected would lead to the eventual death and transformation. Within a few days of being released, the soldiers all became the strange monsters they had just confronted days before, and they spread their disease to the rest of the country. This was a serious pandemic, and the center of it was in England, so the UK had no other choice but to drop a DEB on the area, so they could at least melt the disfigured monsters that killed millions. However, the attempts at ending the disease with DEB were futile, and those infected only appeared to become more ravenous the more they were bombed. Soon even the British government was infected, leading to anarchy and absolute chaos. The process in which people transformed into those disease-ridden monsters came to be known as Excremation. The US, seeing what the bomb had did to the entire nation, became mad with power. To them, you were either with them or against them, and in both circumstances your country would likely be destroyed. The next target of the US's wrath was Japan. Japan, luckily, was prepared for such an event and provided underground shelters for their civilians to protect themselves from the blast. Unfortunately, when the inevitable time came and the bombs dropped, the leaders of Japan weren't able to get to shelter in time, and they all perished. Foolishly and with no leaders, the Japanese citizens walked out onto their fallen country mere moments after the bombs had dropped, leading to their untimely demise. The few people still underground were found by what we call Excremos, those infected with Excre, and were said to have been eaten alive and kicking. The only remains found of them were their skeletons, of which had been gnawed on, and in many cases shattered. At this point, the US had just about every other country as either part of the US or as a demolished wreck. The US next set its eyes on Australia, which wasn't so easy to be taken down. The Australian government already had begun construction of a safe underground area where almost all the citizens could live and stay unaffected from the blast of a bomb of any caliber. The area was started back up when drop-ins were first created, just in case something like this was to occur. When the bombs were dropped, everyone was safe and sound in their own little underground community. But there was one problem. The underground society wasn't completely finished yet, and thus to save space, many innocent people were banished out into the unforgiving, polluted terrain of Australia. Another major problem was that not all of the food had yet been imported, so the survivors still only had about a month left before food ran out, leading to either starvation or cannibalization. The Australian public chose the latter. Those who were weak, sick, or obese were eaten first, the higher-class citizens getting first pickings. Eventually, the cannibalization chain went down the line until only about a fourth of the population remained. Brothers were eating their sisters. Parents were eating their children. It was just absolute mayhem. In the end, many people decided death was a better option, and purging themselves of all their wrongdoings by venturing out into the polluted wasteland they once called home. America had done it. They had successfully eliminated all opposing countries and were alone in the world to prosper. Soon the US's jovial expressions would change to looks of horror as they found out something that led to the end of society as we know it. Australia had numerous spies in the US, many of whom were eventually made into highly powerful members of the government. However, by the end of the war, they had found just about every spy there was, making a message out of them by conducting inhumane experiments on them or performing degrading medieval torture methods, or executions on them such as the brazen bull or saw torture. Out of all the spies, the US could not find the most dangerous spy Australia had, and he had already become a highly powerful part of the government. Once word broke out about Australia's citizens being completely killed off and their country completely destroyed, the spy went insane. He made his way into the Deb and Deep controlling area and set all bombs the US had in their position to launch into or around all the areas that the US controlled. The bombs were deployed, and just like that, the US's fate was sealed. The problem above for all the United States was that they never had to worry about being the target of those bombs, as they were always in control. Thus, they foolishly had no shelters for the US citizens and themselves. They watched in horror as the countdown to Doomsday ticked down. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. An incredibly loud sound was heard in the distance, and a cloud of soot and dust was on the horizon. Within seconds, the White House was engulfed in flames, and all inside was smothered in dust and ridden with disease. The world had fallen to pieces. The date is, I think, June 2nd. No, wait. June 13th, 2056. There are believed to be around 100 people still alive on the Earth, and all of us are on the brink of death. We were born somehow immune to the disease if airborne, but not when consumed, leaving us really to starve, as all food and wildlife are contaminated with Excre. There are more cases of Excre every day, and even the Excremorphs themselves would rather starve than eat our frail, broken bodies. It's harder to breathe every day, as smoke and rubble slowly smother and suffocate us. I know I am on the brink of death. I can somehow feel it. So take these as my final words. A warning, if you will. If the human race survives this nightmare, we cannot become greedy and corrupt like we were before. We need to work together. Stop fighting in useless goddamn wars and shape up as a species. Yes, I know that sounds cheesy, but I see it as the only way that any of us can survive.